This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hanna.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, despite the so-called ceasefire, Israel continues to kill and injure hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza. Since the ceasefire, 312 Palestinians have been murdered in Gaza by the Israeli military and 760 have been injured. We're going to be covering a lot of stories today. There's a lot going on, including the sale of Saudi Arabia F-35 warplanes by the U.S. Administration, by the Trump administration to Saudi Arabia. We're also going to be talking about why in the world did U.S. Ambassador to Israel Huckabee meet with a traitor, a former U.S. citizen, Jonathan Pollard, who spied for Israel for decades and is now living in Israel. Huckabee met with him. It's caused quite a stir among the MAGA elite. And finally, Jamal, we don't have time to cover today, but in the last 24 hours, Israel has bombed Lebanon, specifically around Beirut. They continue to act with impunity. But today, we're going to be watching a very compelling interview you did with Israeli journalist Oren Ziv. He's going to talk about the onslaught of coordinated settler and military pogroms aimed at emptying Palestinians from their homes and villages throughout the West Bank since October 7th. It's a fantastic interview, should be watched by everybody. The settler violence in the West Bank, Jamal, is out of control.
Yeah, so let's watch Oren Ziv. Under the cover of Israel's war on Gaza, coordinated pogroms by Israeli settlers and military have swept through the West Bank, intent on systematically emptying it of Palestinians. Palestinian farmers have been chased from their lands and their livestock mercilessly slaughtered, taking their own source of sustenance from them. This year's olive harvest was singularly violent as settlers burned and sowed countless acres of olive trees and set upon Palestinians and international and Israeli peace activists with clubs and chains. Oren Ziv has long been reporting about Israeli settler attacks throughout the West Bank and has documented that since October 7. Well over 50 rural Palestinian communities have been erased after the inhabitants were forced to abandon their homes amid intensifying assaults, threats, and harassment by Israeli settlers, almost always with the backing of the army and police. His piece in Plus 972 magazine, The Lives and Bodies Forever Scarred by Israeli State-Backed Settler Violence, is a compilation of first-hand accounts from Palestinians, women and children included, who were brutally assaulted and expelled from their homes, which were then often destroyed or set ablaze. Oren is a photojournalist and a reporter for Local Call and Plus 972 magazine and a co-founder of the ActiveStills photography collective. His photographs have also been published in Al Jazeera, Vice, and Tablet, among others. Welcome back to Arab Talk, Oren.
Thank you for having me.
So illegal settlements and settler violence throughout the West Bank have been ongoing. However, more recently, settler outposts have sprung up all over Area C in Palestinian farming and shepherding communities to maximize land theft by taking over huge swaths of pastoral territory. You wrote about a series of settler invasions and the terrorizing of many Palestinian communities in the Jordan Valley that accelerated after October 2023. What is the system that plays out when settlers have their sights on a Palestinian community? How do they move in?
Thank you for the question. It's very important to say that this is a systematic attack in recent weeks because, as you said, the level of violence has become so brutal and high, even inside the Israeli government. Netanyahu and some army officials and politicians have been condemning the settler violence and trying to portray it as if it's something very extreme or fringe, just a small minority of the settler movement. And it is true that the front line, the few hundreds or maybe maximum 1,000, mostly youth or soldiers on vacation that are the front line who physically attack Palestinians on the most, on the most visualized attacks, the ones we see on the media and on social media, they're a small group, but it's important to see, and I will try to explain how they serve not only the Israeli government, but the whole settler movement in the West Bank. So as you said, since October 7th, especially in the first months, when the focus of all the world was in southern Israel and Gaza, the settlers in the West Bank understood this is their moment. I'm talking from day one, October 9, October 10th, they started to attack Palestinian communities that were already targeted before, but they understood this is their money time, the time they can kick them out with no attention. So they just raided communities, attacked them, stole sheep. In other places, they just gave them an ultimatum: you have to leave. And of course, because they were backed up by the army and the police, this could have happened. Another process that is happening is that since October 7, many settlers are doing reserved military service in their own settlements. So while in Gaza or in Lebanon border, people from all across the country would participate, there they're actually doing the duty in the same settlement they live. Is it sometimes legal settlement according to the Israeli law, sometimes outposts? Of course, internationally, they're all illegal. And we're hearing Palestinians telling us, before a settler would come and tell me, go here, don't cross there. And now, since the war, since October 7, he comes on uniform, and the same settler has much more authority, and he can call more backup from the army. The system we've seen, the most popular, is that settlers set up a new outpost. So outpost, at least in the Israeli context, is a settlement that is not authorized by the Israeli government, but of course, under this government, they're getting a lot of support and money and facilities. So many times we would see a bigger outpost sending a new outpost to sit really on the edge of a Palestinian community or even inside a Palestinian community. And then many times Palestinians already are afraid. They saw in other places what's going to happen. They know the harassment, the lack of privacy, the tours between the houses, the theft of sheep or other animals. Many times settlers will do these tours to look for lost or stolen sheep and blame the Palestinians and just take their main source of income. And of course, also much, much more direct violence on attack, burning houses, shooting, and so on. But in many communities, it doesn't have to get to this level of violence. Many times, it's enough that settlers put this front outpost in the edge of the community or inside the community, and Palestinians just run away or are forced to leave because they know nobody will protect them. In those areas, the Palestinian Authority is not present. Only a few activists come there. It's a very remote area, and the settlers basically can do whatever they want. And it's also very comfortable for the Israeli state, because then they can say, no, Palestinians just left on their own. It's not that trucks came and took them away. And we've seen it over and over again across the West Bank, from the northern Jordan Valley to South Hebron and Masaf Riyata. Now, this happened. So we have dozens of communities that were forced to leave in all the area. And we also see that the settlers are moving by plan. So after they force one community out, they continue to the next one. Many times they will dismantle this outpost that they put inside the community, because when the Palestinians left, they're not interested in that area specifically. They want to push Palestinians out of Area C. And it's important to say that while this process is happening in Area C, that to push them away, and this is also things that Smotrich and Ben Gvir talk about all the time, I think, because of the political circumstances, because of the political situation, they understood they cannot annex officially all the West Bank, but they want to control de facto most of it. And while this is happening in Area C, in Area A, in the refugee camps, the army is operating. We've seen it in Jenin, in Tulkarem, in Nur Hasham's camp, in northern West Bank. So basically, it leaves no safe place for Palestinians while settlers and the army are operating in Area C's, in the agriculture areas, in the communities, in the Bedouin communities and other farming communities. And then in Area A, the army is operating with the special forces. And the result, of course, is taking control of hundreds of thousands of dunams.
So what is there an underlying strategy to focus on maximizing gains in Area C and what conditions facilitate land theft by settlers in Area C, for example, as opposed to Area B?
Yeah, so yes, it's a thing that Smotrich talked about it before the election, also Ben Gvir, and today they also control the army totally. So it's an official plan, and we've seen it not only on the ground in the very violent settlers who do this job on the ground. We've seen it with different declarations from the army on new state land, um, taking over more land officially with different orders and warrants, and legalizing, according to the Israeli law, of course, more and more settlements. So outposts that in the past were illegal to, according to the Israeli law, are now being legalized, and they're getting more funding and more support. And it's important to say the tactic is very clear, and we heard that even before the war from the settlers' leader. In the past, they would put a caravan and then slowly get permissions or support and make it a neighborhood and build it, and this takes time. What they did basically already a few years ago before the war, they basically took what Palestinian farmers have been doing for generation and copied, and they understood what with one tent, one water tank, and 100 sheep, and of course with the support of all the Israeli authorities, they can control much more land. We're talking about tens of thousands of dunams, and of course this happens with the support of the army and all the authorities. It's not by itself, but by putting this kind of agriculture farm and copying the tactics of Palestinians, they can control huge amount of areas and at the same time also block the Palestinians. This was the first step, even before the war. First of all, when a new outpost is set, they create a border or a line that Palestinians cannot take their sheep or goats or animals to graze in the open area. And then later they push them more and more towards the houses, and it got to the situation now that Palestinians cannot exit the house. They don't want their sheep to be stolen or injured or killed, and they're locked inside the houses, and still settlers come and storm the houses inside and outside, sometimes in a very violent attacks, injuring people, and sometimes just harassing them, going with their sheep, with the settlers' sheep all around. But with this farming settlement, we're talking about 100 to 120, they managed to control a huge part of the West Bank in a very fast way, not only to push Palestinian community out, but to control the land. And it's much more cheaper. This kind of farm, you can start it with $100,000, $200,000, and compared to building a whole neighborhood and getting the permissions and so on. And this is something we've seen all across the West Bank. And of course, an important part of it is the violence. Either it happens or Palestinians fear from it because they saw it in other places, but the attacks, either at night, burning houses, raiding houses, or on day, it's a very important part to make Palestinians scared. And this is why people leave, not because they want to leave, because they have no other choice and they want to save their lives. Sometimes they want to save the property, the animals, the other things they have. So this relatively small group of few hundreds or maybe 1,000 settlers who operate in as terror group, in operations, they're very important to the whole settlement movement and to the Israeli government, because they create the conditions to kick people away, to force them away. Now, when we're talking about coordinated attacks, so I was in one of them a few months ago in Turmus Aya, a village that many of its residents have American passports and have family in the US, and despite that, they don't get any protection, not from the US embassy in the area, and of course, not from the Israeli government. And I've been there on the way back from a funeral I was passing in this village, and I saw this attack unfolding, and you see it, and we hear it from Palestinians all the time. When they attack, it's not sporadic. They come in groups. One group is in charge of setting things on fire. They go with this Molotov cocktails or other things to set things on fire. Other group throw stones and push the Palestinians. Another group is doing graffiti. They're working like an organized terror group, like a military. They have radios, they have weapons. They always have somebody in the back with rifles if the Palestinians come out and confront them, so they can shoot them and say that they were attacked. And the most important thing is that they're backed up by the Israeli army. Some of these people are Israeli soldiers off duty on vacation that live in those areas and are participating. You can see it from the weapons, from the rifles they have, and from the few cases people were arrested. And B, when the army arrived, either they would shoot at the Palestinian, tear gas or even live ammunition to push them away and practically help the attackers, or in the more positive scenario, they will just like tell the people, please go back, and follow them back to the settlement or the settlement area. Now, you asked me before about Area C and Area B. We've seen a shift in recent months, in the last year. Now settlers are invading Area B. Now settlers are trying to set outposts in Area B. The woman in Turmus Aya that was beaten during the olive harvest, the very famous video, this is an outpost. The settlers, at least from the videos, came from an outpost, Or Nachman, that is sitting in Area B and blocking Palestinian communities. In areas in the past, there were no outposts, there were no settlements in that area. So it's very clear, and they're at least showing us that they're not gonna stop with Area C. They're gonna go to Area B. We don't have on Area A yet outposts, but we've seen attacks of settlers in Area A, sorry, in the lands of Masra al-Sharqiya. Also, 2 Palestinians were killed there on May, one of them with American citizenship. So we see that they're not going to stop. Their aim is to push Palestinians. In the beginning, they took the grazing land, the open land that Israel defines as state land, but of course it's Palestinian land. Then they went for the farming communities, the Bedouin communities. When they finish with that, they're going to the villages. And not only villages, even towns like Turmus Aya, big places. When you say a village, somebody can imagine a few houses. It's big villages with thousands of residents and villagers. So they're aiming to that, and of course, and unfortunately, I'm saying it. I think the day that a whole village will be evicted is not so far. Maybe not a whole village, but parts of a village, or most people choose to move to a bigger city and come just on the weekends because it's going to be too hard to travel or to live there. It's something we might see in the near future, unfortunately. And of course, and it's very important to say all the time, this is happening not only with the backup of the army that on the ground does nothing to stop it, doesn't treat them at all. All the time, the army is giving excuses that they cannot deal with Israelis. It's the job of the police. But the police is not present in the West Bank so much, especially under Ben Gvir. The police is controlled by Ben Gvir and other settlers, extreme settlers. But more important, soldiers on the ground. As somebody, as a journalist, who've been to many, many demonstrations in the West Bank, we know that soldiers, when they want, they can stop not only Palestinians, they can stop journalists, they can stop internationals, they can stop Israeli activists. Me, as an Israeli, was stopped many times by the army, even detained, and then they call the police. So we know that when they want, they can stop any person moving in the area. There, in the end of the day, the Israeli army is controlling the occupied West Bank. When it comes to settlers, they make all kinds of excuses to say we cannot detain them, we cannot stop them, but they don't want. It's comfortable for them that this attack happen, and B, many of them support it. Personally, I think what happened now during the olive harvest, and according to the UN, in the month of October was the most violent month we've seen in 20 years since OCHA started to research and collect this data. We've seen 260 attacks, half of them regarding the olive harvest. And I can say personally, there might have been much more ones who were not reported, small incidents or things that Palestinians don't report. But in general, this became such a brutal month, with also visual evidence. We saw this old woman in Turmus Aya being beaten. We saw other incidents. We saw attacks on journalists, like our colleague Ranin Sawafta from Reuters, that was brutally attacked by settlers in Beta in the last day of the olive harvest village in Beta. So this became such a big issue and so visualized. So even the Israeli establishment, the prime minister, the chief of staff, had to, very weakly condemn it and to say, but all the time when they condemn it, they say this doesn't represent the whole settlement movement in the West Bank. This is people who create damage. They also attack, this also happens on the background. They attack soldiers sometimes in the few times that soldiers try to stop them or to interrupt them, their attacks. So we've seen that. We've seen settlers leaders saying, yeah, they're not from the West Bank. They actually come from proper Israel, 48 Israel. But this is not true. It's just many of them are troubled youth that are not registered in the West Bank. Maybe they're registered somewhere else where they were born, but de facto they lived they live in this outpost. They're there all the time. Just to make it clear, it just became too much. So it became too much to continue quietly, even on mainstream media, on American media, or even on Israeli media. So they had to do something. But it's important to say that despite the fact it was all over the Israeli media, which the Israeli media, we talked about it before, doesn't deal with the West Bank and Gaza when it's not regarding violence towards Israeli. So despite that, we've seen the attack continuing and even escalating. I think those groups want to send a message. We're not afraid. I've been to a mosque in Dir Istia, near Salfit, in the central West Bank, where it was just in this week, there was some people talking about it in the government, and they wrote, "We're not afraid," from Avi Balouf. It's the commander of the West Bank. And they wrote there, "You can continue to condemn us." So they wrote it on a mosque when they set part of the mosque on fire. So it's a clear message. We're not afraid of all these talks. And they know better, I think, than the Israeli media that, now people are talking about it for a few days. Tomorrow, the media will go to another topic, the politicians, and they can continue. And we've seen these attacks escalating. We've seen last week there was a rare eviction of an outpost in the West Bank of Israeli settlers. The army and the police evicted. So directly after, they went and revenged against Palestinians. We've seen it. I was in the village of Jabba near Bethlehem. They went in, burned cars, tried to set houses on fire, like to kill, like they did to the Dewabsha families in other cases. They didn't succeed because people closed the windows. They burned some cars. They wrote some racist graffiti, and also there, they came with their cars. They went to the village. They went back. Nobody stopped them. There was no arrest. The army arrived late. It's important to say, when we're talking about who is this group of what they call hilltop youth or extreme settlers, in the end of the day, they come from a settlement and go back, and each outpost is connected to a bigger settlement. So it means they're getting support, at least silent support, from these places. They come with cars. They come many times security guards, official security guards of the settlement, or the army will come with them to escort them to see they're not attacked by Palestinians. So it's a systematic attack, and especially in the environment in the West Bank, and that the Israeli army and police and security services, they can arrest any Palestinian in every moment. We've seen the Israeli army going into Ramallah to arrest an ex-prisoner, or sometimes arrest for social media. They can find any Palestinian in every moment. The whole area is full of cameras, all the main roads in the West Bank. They can tap every phone. We know the technology Israeli used both in Gaza and in the West Bank. We wrote about it a lot on I-72. And compared to that, it's kind of surprising, or it shows that they don't want to arrest anyone, because obviously if they would want to arrest those settlers, they could have, by phones, by cameras, whatever. Even in Turmus Aya, in the case, this woman, Afaf, 53 years old, was severely attacked and beaten. They arrested one settler. And now they might charge him, because this became, if you look at the videos and talk to eyewitnesses, there were 50 or 60 settlers there. So they always try to focus on one person. But this guy didn't go by himself to the village and attack an old lady harvesting her trees. Obviously, he could come because this was an organized terror attack. And they always try, and even legally, there's a big difference between attacking person to person or attacking in a terror group, in an organized attack. Even in the Israeli law, there's a difference between that. And they always they never do it. So they don't investigate the general plan and the support they get. I was there, not on the attack, the day after. The settler come on the small ATVs they got from Smotrich and Orit Struk, from different ministers in the West Bank. So all this is supported by the government, and by the way, could not continue one day without the logistic, economical, and security support of the government.
When you mentioned the settlers themselves now are wearing uniforms, and then I keep hearing about the desert frontier, the settler military outfit. What's the role of that desert frontier?
The desert frontier was actually, if I'm not mistaken, it was closed after, on October 10th, they were part of a big attack on Wadi Sik, a community east of Ramallah. And these are basically settlers that the army wants to include in the army So they take people who are anyway very troubled, not to say violent, and put them to patrol in the area that anyway they live, and there's a lot of communities they want to deport and force out. After a very severe case that they were attacking Palestinian residents, activists, and Israeli activists, actually de facto kidnapping them, holding them in a tent and torturing them on October 7th and on October 10th, sorry, in Wadi Sik. So this unit was specifically closed, this specific unit or group. But they don't, to be honest, they don't need it now because they can operate freely in all the territory. So sometimes you have the people with full uniforms that they're doing the reserve service, and now they come with much, much more authority. But sometimes in the attacks or just in different events, you see them with half uniform, just the pants or the rifle of the Israeli army. Uh, but basically, it's different forms of the same approach. Since October 7th, they can do what they want in the West Bank. Nobody cares. Nobody looks at it. We're talking about villages living, 300, 400 people that were living there for dozens of years. And many of them are refugees originally from the Nakab, that after the Nakba moved to Hebron area and with time immigrated to the Jordan Valley. And they're not the landowners usually where they live. They're renting it or have different agriculture agreements with the communities living near Ramallah, for example. And these are the weakest and the poorest communities in the West Bank. And it's very easy to push them away. When I talk to the army many times about it to ask for a response, they will tell me, no, there was no community there. There was just a few Bedouins there. And I tell them, no, you can look on aerial photos. You can look in evidence. These communities are there for dozens of years. And many times they were moved inside the West Bank a few times by the army already in the 60s, in the late 60s and the 70s and the 80s. But even when you talk to the army, you see it's non-issue. I think it's the general approach, maybe the general genocidal approach. That Palestinians, you can, like we've seen in Gaza, you can tell 1 million people today you have to move from here to there, so it's of course less severe than in Gaza, but it's the same approach. Palestinians, they can just leave, they can just move. They don't have any value to where the place they've been living for dozens of years. Specifically in this case, I'm talking about the community of Marajat near Jericho, that was living there for dozens of years, many of them refugees from the Nakab. And the settlers in July just opened the outpost in the village, escalated the violence that was already happening. It's always like there's outposts around it. At one moment, they decide to put the outposts really in the community and invade houses, steal sheep, attack people physically. And at some point, people just leave. They don't want to die. They don't want to risk their children, their family, and people are forced to leave. And the sad thing for me is that people go all over just to random places because the areas around the villages, around the cities are full with this kind of refugees. So people just go to open areas, live there for a few months, maybe then have to move again. But even more sad is also the loss of a community. It's people who have been living together for dozens of years, many times from the same extended family, and this is gone. I talk to people. The big change.
I was going to mention in your article, you talk about, of course, the settlers' heinous attacks, and also you have first-hand accounts in your article. For example, you have one by talk about Muhammad Da'amin, where settlers attacked his family, including an infant, then went on to torture and blind his sheep. And then you have other stories. Can you talk about some of these stories?
Yeah, definitely. So the project we did was the idea to bring kind of the stories behind the Israeli violence in the West Bank, because we hear it about all the time and the news circle is so fast. So many times we don't get to the people themselves and what's happening. And I think for me, it was interesting also to go between all the areas in the West Bank and 15 cases, I think 14 or 15 cases, to show there's also a system. You see in the pictures, many people are attacked in the head, in the legs. It's attacks in order to kill. It's not just before to scare somebody. It's really, I talked to journalist Issam Rimawi, who was documenting farmers near Turmusaya in Khirbet Abu Falah. And when he was on the way to the car, he already thought the settlers were pushed away. Settlers surprised him when he already took his protective gear, attacked him, and attacked him in the head, and he collapsed and lost his conscience. And he thinks, and eyewitnesses from around said that they ran away because they thought they killed him, so they just ran away, leaving him to bleed. So we've seen it that also inside the incidents, it becomes much more violent. We've seen it with Ranin Sawafta in Reuters. She's not in the project. I photographed her later. They attacked her in the helmet. They made a hole in her protective gear. About Muhammad Ta'amin, it's a very interesting story because he lives in the edge of a Palestinian town, Samoa, which is Area B, near Hebron, a bit south of Hebron. And he's the last house before the outpost. In the past, it was very far, and with the war, they got closer and closer. And they just came to his house, pepper sprayed his family. They had to run out of the house. And then they went to the sheep to torture and kill them in a very brutal way. And I think the message is clear also to say, we will harm all your life, all your aspect of life. So they destroyed his house, but also his income, the sheep that he grows, a few sheep, they wanted to injure and sabotage. And he doesn't want to leave. He has support from his family. Luckily, after a few minutes, he could call his family, his extended family, who came and chased the settlers out. So his kids were injured from tear gas, but not more severely. But obviously, for example, there, if they push him out, they will control another 1 or 2 kilometers from the outpost to the main town. So it's a very organized tactic to push people, to make them tired, to make them scared, obviously. And many people told me we cannot protect ourselves. Even if I try to protect myself when armed settlers attack me, if I will push them or try to block them, I could be arrested. They can call the police and say that I attacked them. And when they call the police, obviously the police shows up. So we heard it again and again. Maybe the only optimistic side of the story is that for many people, we heard the fact that they're insisting to stay despite the attacks. They get some hope from activists, local and international activists that stand with them, and they want to stay, or come back, because I documented also people who were forced out of their houses and were attacked while being forced out. But many people told me that they want to stay despite the level of violence that is escalating.
You wrote actually an excellent piece about a year ago detailing how many Palestinians communities have just disappeared in the wake of the repeated attacks on their homes and schools and communities. What would you estimate the number is now a year later?
It's hard to say. We're talking about at least 80 either communities or kind of extended family clusters. So around 80 points on the map that were pushed out. And of course, unfortunately, it's continue every week. We hear about a community that is on the edge of leaving, that the army or the settlers together give them deadline of threats or different things. We're just working on towards the December, to the end of the year, to do another roundup about the situation in the West Bank. So for sure we update, but the trend is very, very clear, moving from Area C to Area B and attacking not only small communities, but also big villages or even towns, and in places that in the past you wouldn't see any Israeli settler. Now they go in, they try to normalize the fact they can walk there, do all these kind of tours or hikes there. And of course, this is a excuse to invade and to scare people, to terrify people, and also to create provocation, because if somebody comes out and try to push them away, they have all the legitimacy either to shoot by themselves or to call the army and the police. And we've seen it just a few weeks ago, I think 2 months ago, in El Murayra, another village that has been on the target of settlers east of Ramallah, that 3 settlers take their sheep and invade the village. The outpost is very far. It's maybe 2 kilometers walking in the mountains, but they go in, people see them, go out to push them out, also throw stones at them, and then they just shoot. And from that, 24-year-old youth was killed. And of course, nobody is held accountable for that. And for the army, for the police, for the Israeli media, it's like settlers who've been attacked while going on a hike or a trip or whatever. Nobody talks about the fact they invaded a village with weapons. So unfortunately, I think uh, as long as they get the governmental support, the army support, the police support, this will continue. Even if for a minute some people are condemning them, it doesn't seem it bothers them.
So the Palestinians, and which we know that for many years they don't receive any justice from the Israeli government or any protection from the Israeli military. Yet you also give accounts of Israeli peace activists who give security presence during the olive harvest, and they are not themselves spared by the settlers. They get attacked. You yourself were attacked. Uh, so do you or other Israeli peace activists have a better chance than Palestinians in prosecuting these settlers in these circumstances?
That's an excellent question because I think it's a very interesting point. So many Israeli, more left-wing radical activists, and also internationals are doing what is called protective presence, being in these villages in order to document and to try to stop the violence. Many times, because if they call the police, it's a bit better. They can speak in Hebrew or English, or if they confront the settlers, they can talk to them and try. And we've seen maybe through the last 20 years that I've been documenting things in the West Bank, we've seen an escalation that in the past you could have say if there would be activists, Israeli or international, if there would be journalists, it would be less risky. You could estimate the level of risk. And today, we've seen attack all over the West Bank in any places, also in places that were considered very calm or peaceful, and that there were no attacks before, and even towards journalists or activists. Today, when I go to the field, uh, I take in consideration that it can be attacked any moment. In the past, when I would see settlers say, okay, we're a big group of activists, of journalists, there's diplomats here, there's this, there's that. Today, it doesn't matter for them, as we've seen on the attack of activists and media. On the other hand, so we've seen this change that being Israeli, being international, being a journalist doesn't protect you, doesn't prevent violence, because the settlers just don't give a care. They don't care. They have full impunity. They know nobody will arrest them 99% of the time, or even more. On the other hand, talking to Palestinians, there's still a lot of value to this presence. For the time it does manage to prevent something, we don't know, on the times that it prevents, if the settlers prepare something or pass by and see, in the times that the attacks don't happen, you cannot know if it didn't happen because of a presence of activists, or just because the settlers were not in the mood that day to attack. But we hear it from Palestinians that it's very important for them that people will be there, both Israeli radical left-wing activists and international, to witness, to photograph, to talk, to try to de-escalate. Of course, everybody knows that if settlers organized attack, nothing can stop them, even not the army and the police, even if the army would want. But it's still very important for communities that there will be somebody there. I'll give a small example. Many times soldiers, when they come, they would take the phones from Palestinians, search them, say you cannot film, although according to the law, you are now allowed to film for sure in your home, but in your house or home, but also in a public area. So many times when there's activists, they can insist on that. No, it's allowed to film. No, you cannot take my phone, because many times they don't want any documentation to this kind of attacks or harassment, either by settlers or by the army. So we hear it from more and more Palestinians that it is important to them, this presence, despite the fact that they know better than anyone that it cannot always prevent it, but it's important to them that people will be with them on the ground.
But as an Israeli, if you get attacked, do you and you file a complaint against the attacker, against the settler, do you have a chance of receiving justice versus a Palestinian? They just won't listen to the Palestinian claim.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that as an Israeli who can walk to a police station, either inside 48 Israel or in the West Bank, and complain. As a Palestinian, you need to get to the entrance to the police station and wait. And even if they let you in, maybe there's no investigator or translator at the time. So many times it's hours and hours of arguing with them and getting permits and the lawyers, because the police stations are inside the settlements or settlement industrial zone. So not any Palestinian can just walk and enter there. So yeah, as an Israeli, you can complain. Many Israelis choose not to complain because they are aware of the system and how it works, and they don't think they will receive not even something close to justice. So some of the activists that I interviewed don't even complain. Others did go. The two activists that were attacked in Michmas actually said the police was listening to them. But still, even though during the process they were not so hostile and actually listened to them. Their case was also in the Israeli media because they were very severely beaten, and it was also in Israeli mainstream media. But even though the fact they got kind of a fair behavior from the police, they didn't try to blame them in anything as they do to Palestinians and also to activists, saying you created a provocation. Despite that, we haven't seen any arrests. So on the bottom line, no, it's the same for the police. I'll give another example on the event in Beta in the beginning of November, where Ranin Sawafta from Reuters attacked also Oded Didaya, a 77 years old Israeli activist, artist, photographer, manager of an art school, director of an art school in Tel Aviv. He was very severely attacked. They broke a part of his cheek, a bone here. He was bleeding. His photo was published everywhere. He was interviewed in all the Israeli media. And just to give you the example of how the Israeli media or the public looks on it, so he spoke very well. He said, "We came to the olive harvest. I always come with my camera to document what's happening. Then from nowhere, the settlers attacked, surprised him. He ran away, but they chased him, and the settler was on top, and there was these terraces, and they just threw rocks at him, not even stones, but big rocks. And then the TV host asked him live, but you came with a tripod and a camera, so maybe you were like requesting it or inviting it or creating the situation, which is crazy for somebody very old, obviously not creating any threat, but was severely injured, and he could easily die there bleeding because he was alone. Everybody ran to different directions, and he fell on the ground, lost his conscious, and just by luck woke up and called people, and they rescued him. But he could easily finish in a much, much worse condition. And even in this clear that it's all documented and very clear, and he's also a photographer and a well-known person inside Israel, they try to blame this TV host. Later apologized, but it shows you the instinct to say, you came with a camera, you were looking for violence, you came to help. He's both an activist and a photographer and an artist, but kind of immediately blaming it on him, that maybe because he came to a Palestinian village with Palestinians invited him in there, and then he gets attacked. It's his fault. It shows you the kind of mindset to say, no, they don't attack just like this. For sure, you did something. You got closer for them. You did some provocation, and so on. And unfortunately, I think this kind of mindset is what allows it to happen. Most of the time, it happens on the dark, and when even inside Israel, when it's exposed, they find different excuses to justify. But in this event, as far as I know, there was no arrest. Although Reuters photographer injured severely, she will not be able to work for months. Her security advisor, nowadays, the West Bank is so dangerous, so international photographers, or she's a Palestinian working for international body, they go with a security advisor, like in Ukraine, like in Syria, somebody that is responsible for their security. He was also injured. He's British. And other people, other journalists and activists, including Israelis, were injured, and the police did nothing. No arrest. The army didn't even arrive on time. The army arrived half an hour after it finished. Didn't even come to help them or to rescue them. So it shows you that the whole system is kind of created to allow these attacks to happen. And as I said before, in the end of the day, this extreme violence, this violence serves them to push Palestinians out, and it's much more comfortable for the state, for the mainstream set to say, no, these are the extreme, but they're doing kind of the dirty job for everyone.
Well, I mean, we keep hearing again. You've mentioned that some Israeli special politicians like to describe these settlers as a fringe element. Last time when we talked, you said the opposite, that they were in fact a reflection of Israeli society. Is this fringe element now controlling the narrative when it comes to how to deal with Palestinians? Is the pursuit of greater Israel increasingly a goal for Israel society at large?
Yeah, so, the center left, for example, in Israel, I'm sure officially many of them are against it. And this is why it gets also to mainstream media. The kind of people who are protesting, that used to protest for hostages, that are protesting against Netanyahu, they're generally against it. They're not in favor of it. And they were also against, settling in Gaza. They were supporting the horrific war, but against settling in Gaza. So settlers as a whole are not that popular in mainstream Israel, or at least in the more central-left part. but the fact they can continue and under many governments and for dozens of years to do what they do is because many people don't really look at what's happening in the West Bank. This is happening far away from Tel Aviv, from Jerusalem, from the big cities, although it's physically only a few dozens of kilometers from here. So I think, despite people maybe oppose it, and before the war, we've seen even in the mainstream protests after the pogrom in Hawara that was very big, mainstream Israelis were protesting against it. And, under this government with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, even the legal changes Netanyahu was promoting, in large, it was also to promote annexation of the West Bank. So, under this government, you don't have to be very radical left to see the connections between the government, the extreme ministers, and the violence on the ground, right? Of course, what happened in Gaza kind of shifted the focus. But I think now it's a bit changing. But in general, I think, and this is even before October 7, this can continue because, people can protest, people can like it or not like it. In the end, in the West Bank, they have their own set of law. They control the police now with Ben Gvir. They control big parts of the army. They have weapons. They have the power, and they continue, as they say in the graffiti, you can condemn, and we will continue. I think, and you can see it, that the people, the Israelis who go to do protective presence and so on are only a few hundreds of people. It's a very small group. Obviously, the people who are protesting in Tel Aviv, it's tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. Of course, if some more of them would come, the situation would be different. But also, I think also for many of the mainstream Israelis, those are extreme settlers, and they don't see the connection to the establishment, to the army, to the mainstream settlers, to see the system. We've just been talking about it in our conversation. It's, I think, for everybody, for most of the political map in Israel, it's easy to say those are extreme people. They're not connected to Israel. This is, by the way, why in my article I wrote Israelis and not settlers, because I think also in the Israeli context, calling them settlers kind of makes it far away from the average Israelis. I want to say these are Israelis doing it. It's not something far away from you or something, in another planet. These are Israelis with Israeli IDs who get support from the Israeli government, from the Israeli army. And this is why they can continue to do it.
Oren Ziv, as usual, thank you for coming on Arab Talk and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.
That's the voice and the face of Oren Ziv. He's an Israeli journalist who's been talking about and writing about the explosive increase in settler violence against Palestinian civilians, against property, personnel, against farms, it's just like endemic, Jamal. And we don't hear about this in the media here in the United States anywhere. But essentially, the West Bank is under total siege right now.
Sure is. And, with the distraction of what's going on in Gaza, these settlers have been moving now, expanding their control in the West Bank, in Area C, and even in Area B, which was unheard of before. And even they're also going into Area A, like villages and towns under the control of the Palestinian Authority. They're trying to take advantage of this focus on Gaza. And it's really very scary. Some people say that at some point, Palestinians will have to respond, and that's what the settlers want. And this way, they can drag in the military to basically occupy the entire West Bank.
Right. Well, they want a Gaza equivalent in the West Bank, Jamal. They're trying to provoke Palestinians. You're absolutely right.
So moving on to our next story, Jazz, which Israel tried its best to prevent Saudi Arabia from purchasing the F-35 advanced fighter jets from the United States by conditioning the sale, telling the Trump administration that Saudi Arabia needs to join basically the Abraham Accords, which Saudi Arabia said, no way, we're not going to have this discussion as long as we're not talking about a state for the Palestinian people. But the Trump administration, despite all the pressure and the pressure by AIPAC and others, is going ahead with the sales. Of course, the sale has to go through Congress. And they're saying they're selling the F-35s, but they're going to be a little bit less advanced than those used by Israel.
Yeah, Jamal, that's an important story because it shows the kind of shift that we're seeing under the Trump administration and among many in the MAGA community away from supporting unconditional support for Israel to then supporting the business and strategic interests of the Gulf region, really over the fidelity to Israel. But I want to just say something really quick. You have to listen to MBS's words very carefully. He's not saying we're conditioning joining the Abraham Accords on the creation of a Palestinian state. If you listen to his words carefully, he said he's waiting for a pathway to a Palestinian state. And you and I both know words matter. A pathway to a Palestinian state is not a Palestinian state. So lots going on with the sale of those F-35s and the Abraham Accords and the shifting balance to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region.
Well, it tells me also another thing is that when there is a will, there is a way, and reminds me of when the Israeli lobby tried to put pressure on Ronald Reagan not to sell Saudi Arabia the
Right.
AWACS planes, and then he said, "Well, keep up that pressure because I'm going to take it to the American people. You know, you're losing Americans." Jobs and billions of dollars and so forth, and of course the F-35, probably going to be billions of dollars of income to American companies.
And jobs.
When
Right.
Israel gets the F-35, well, we give them the money to buy it back from us, right? So it's kind of funny that the imbalance, but at least Donald Trump knows at least to say no. Because at the end of the day, he's a businessman and he doesn't want to lose the United States, both jobs and income.
Exactly, Jamal. And MBS has promised to invest in the United States up to a trillion, not billions, Jamal, $1 trillion in the United States with various investments in AI, energy, and other things. So this is and Trump and the Trump organization have multiple business ventures in Saudi Arabia right now. So I don't see Donald Trump actually not going along with the F-35 sale and doing as much business and support of MBS as possible. And of course, the big press conference in which they asked MBS and Trump about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and Trump gave MBS a complete pass on that.
So moving on to the next story, Jazz, which is mind-boggling. Convicted
Great
Israeli spy. Actually, it's not an Israeli spy. He's an American traitor.
He's an American spy.
Yeah, he's an American traitor. Traitor, that's the word. Jonathan Pollard gets invited to meet with, which is unheard of, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. Now, since he was released and moved to Israel, we had other ambassadors. None of them would meet with him, right? And now comes Huckabee. I mean, this is a traitor. This is a traitor that basically it wasn't just ideological. He wanted to help Israel because he's Jewish, and that's what people like to focus on. But no, that wasn't the case. He did it for money. He betrayed this country for money. He was getting paid money to pass on very high intelligence information to Israel, which, by the way, Israel was passing to then the USSR. I mean, harming American interests. That's why a lot of the top ranking generals, they were going crazy when there was a decision to release him. They kept refusing to release him for many years. And you know who was one of his biggest advocates? Mike Huckabee.
That's right. Mike Huckabee was the one who really pushed under the first Trump administration to get him released. And we should emphasize, Jamal, Jonathan Pollard was the most notorious American traitor in the modern era. He betrayed American interests. He betrayed America. He did it for money, as you said, but the damage he caused to the U.S. intelligence agencies and to the strategic interests of the United States is really unmatched. So why is Huckabee meeting with Jonathan Pollard? What's the deal, Jamal?
What's so important?
I know. I don't get it.
And here is the thing, and this is confirmed by the White House, even though they try to downplay this. You know, when you have a controversial meeting, you clear it with the State Department. Mike Huckabee would pick up the phone, call the Secretary of State, or at least call the President, one or the other. Or, you know, usually if you want to follow just the ranks, because he works for the Secretary of State and the President,
Exactly.
he might pick up the phone and call to clear, say, hey, I'm going to meet. I don't know how would that conversation be. I'm going to meet with that. You remember that ex-spy that screwed up this country, the traitor Bigley. I'm going to meet with him in my office, and he didn't do that. And when they asked the spokesperson for Trump, and he said no, the president didn't know about it, but she was telling the media that you're making a big deal, like the meeting happens all over. But the question is, he didn't clear it with the Secretary of State. He didn't clear it with the President of the United States. And this is not like meeting with a even it's not as bad meeting. We always talk about Smotrich and Ben Gvir, right. But those are controversial Israeli figures. This guy is an American traitor, betrayed this country.
Unsafe.
In other countries, he would have been given the death sentence. Actually, in this country, they gave the Rosenbergs for much lesser crime the death sentence. Yes.
Well, what's interesting to me, showing Huckabee's hand, he refused to put it on his calendar. He tried to hide it. So that's, I think, evidence of guilt on his part, and knowing and knowledge that this was not just controversial, but really a bad move on so many levels. So, Jamal, we see Huckabee. Huckabee he still doesn't believe Palestinians exist. Huckabee doesn't even call or use the words West Bank and Gaza. He used Judea and Samaria. The guy is an extremist himself, and he is the ambassador, the American ambassador to the United States, meeting with a traitor, an American traitor. It's a bizarre story. I don't see people being as outraged about this as they should, Jamal. It's really, really bizarre that there isn't more outrage about this.
In a normal world, he would have been called back to Washington, D.C. and just
slapped.
And slapped, or maybe just replaced. I mean, people have done less things. And he goes against, by the way, American diplomacy, because even when Donald Trump said the U.S. will not, allow Israel to annex the West Bank, he basically, in an Israeli media in early September, said that the U.S. would not stop Israel from annexing the occupied West Bank. The total opposite. Then he kind of backtracked that later on, saying, well, I don't make policy here and so forth. I really don't know why they're basically allowing him to go against the American basically policies.
Well, it's going to have dramatic impacts, Jamal. We'll be reporting on this because based on our interview with Ziv, settler violence is out of control. Huckabee hasn't even condemned it, even slightly. He's made some noises about it. But, settler violence against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank and Jerusalem is not just out of control. The United Nations and other organizations really are questioning whether or not this also amounts to crimes against humanity. So, stay tuned. We're going to continue to report on all of these events.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.